This is lecture 101 on the Neolithic, Chalcolithic, and Bronze Age of France, which are the archaeological manifestations of tribal agriculture, simple chiefdoms, and advanced theocratic chiefdoms. Bronze Age, at least in part. And that eventually becomes part of the slave stage as a kingdom. But at any rate, we're going to deal with these three archaeological phases and these three stages. And as I was preparing this lecture, you know, the last time we dealt with the Neolithic Revolution in Iberia, and when I was preparing this lecture on the same thing in France, it reminded me of April 1961, and that every day above ground is a good day. I had a real weight lifted from my shoulders as I crossed the border back into France on the French Riviera. During World War II, Franco had been on the Nazi side and had sent 3 divisions to help Hitler attack Stalingrad. And naturally, we in the U.S. Army Military Intelligence had been deployed against Franco's secret thugs at that time. And the point is that we had a history that extended in 1961 when I returned, as the Franco's guys saw it, in April. And this time I did have a mission, although I was ostensibly on vacation. Now, I had barely escaped Franco's secret police in Valencia on a night a few days earlier, when I realized that several of them were surrounding me at the tables in this nightclub, and instinctively I knew it was now or never kind of situation. And I wasn't armed because I had decided that it might be wiser not to be captured with a gun on me if I was on vacation. At this point I wished I hadn't made that decision, but at any rate, somehow they had seen through my vacation cover, probably from our friends in the CIA, and recognized my intelligence mission, and I had to escape. Now, I stood up calmly and I went to the caballeros, that is, the men's room, and there I saw my one chance in front of me, and I stepped over the feet imprints in concrete in front of the hole that passed for a urinal, grabbing one handhold and stepping on another, lifting myself through the opening that passed for a window that was above it. Thoughtfully, it was always open to relieve the stench, and I crawled through it, falling to the street, just evading a shower of bullets. Now, making it to the ground and running several blocks, I ducked into a first hallway with a beckoning prostitute, and there I was able to hide a few hours, long enough to lose my pursuers. And I had been on the run ever since, first through Madrid, then back to Barcelona, and finally now across the frontier on my way to Nice. At any rate, those thoughts were going through my mind as I prepared for this discussion, and it's time to go back to our topic. To begin with, the early Neolithic Revolution from 8000 BP to 6500 BP, the stage of tribal agriculture in France. Now, France lies in the middle of the European appendage to the Asian continent. Directly to its south are the Pyrenees Mountains, and to the northeast the Alps. These mountains seal off Iberia and Italy for practical purposes. As with all the mountains of France, their ultimate cause has been the impact of the continental African plate against the Eurasian plate. Now, as we've seen, people entered that part of Europe we call France over 1 million years ago. By 400,000 BP, we've also seen that on the coast of southern France, they had become true broad-spectrum exploiters of animals and plants, and by 20,000 BP, they had been experimenting with horticulture. By 8,000 BP, seafaring colonists from Italy, carrying a full complement of plants and animals originally domesticated countless times among the hilly flanks of Southwest Asia, reached the Riviera of coastal France. There they met indigenous farming families. The practical effect on human movement across the European appendage has been the necessity for people to move along the Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts while journeying east to west or west to east. The early Neolithic, 8000 to 7500 BP, marks the first appearance of food-producing cultures in the south, leading to the future linear pottery culture that ranges from the Koros of southern Hungary into France. Now, these tribal farmers were moving up the Danube, practicing slash-and-burn agriculture, and along their way they spread the initial Danubium-1 early linear pottery, abbreviated LBK. Cultural diagnostics and the concomitant stone toolkit proves this. The Mediterranean seashell, Spondylus Jadaropus and the similarity of the pottery to gourds unknown in the north, along with recent genetic evidence, corroborate the lithic archaeology. Now, these early agricultural peoples carried domesticated plants and animals originally from these hilly flanks as well as plants and animals domesticated from locally based forerunners. Now, French Neolithic archaeology begins with this initial spread of agriculture and is periodized with ceramic typology. First is pottery named Starchevo-Koros pottery, found in the European-wide contiguous food-producing region. Much of the Starchevo-Koros pottery features decorative patterns composed of convolute bands of paint, spirals, converging bands, vertical bands, and so on. This ceramic tradition, cat's chewing on something. This ceramic tradition evolved into the linear pottery culture, linear Banderkammerik, which is where the initials LBK come from. That imitates and improves on these convolutions with incised lines. Thus the term linear, distinguishing painted bandware from incised bandware. Now, in the middle phase of the early linear pottery culture, people moved along the Bug-Neister River and are easily differentiated because they made musical note pottery. A number of cultures ultimately replaced the linear pottery culture over this range, and some of the successor cultures are the Hinkelstein, the Grobgartok, the Rawson, Lengyel, Guanteni, Tripilian, and Volan Maritza cultures. In the late phase, the stroked pottery culture moved down the Vistula and Elbe. Now, the LBK did not begin with this range and only reached it toward the end of its time. It began in regions of densest occupation on the Middle Danube, specifically in Bohemia, Moravia, and Hungary, and spread over about 900 miles along these rivers in 360 years. That rate of expansion, therefore, was about 2.4 miles per year. Now, the LBK was concentrated somewhat inland from the coastal areas. That is, it is not present in Denmark or the northern coastal strips of Germany and Poland, or the coast of the Black Sea in Romania. These northern coastal regions were occupied by long-lasting Mesolithic cultures exploiting the rich Atlantic salmon runs. There are lighter concentrations of LBK at Eslu in the Netherlands, with the sites of Darien, Remicourt, Fexi, and Orem Longchaps, and at the mouths of the Oder and Vistula. In Poland and in Neolithic agriculturists often lived next to these people. The LBK at maximum extent ranged from about the line of the Seine-Oise in the Paris Basin, eastward to the line of the Dnieper, and southward to the line of the upper Danube down to its Big Bend. Now, an extension ran through the southern Bug Valley, leaped to the valley of the Dniester, and swerved southward from the middle Dniester to the lower Danube in eastern Romania, east of the Carpathians. Radiocarbon dating of the LBK gives dates of 7,600 to 6,750 BP. In Belgium, the LBK lasted longer, as late as 6,100 years ago. Now, as these interlopers merged with indigenous farmers, some next-generation families moved inland as crop farmers. One example occurs when these newly merged populations occupied nearby mountains and valleys of the Languedoc province of France. Those with herds of domesticated animals took to the plains with their grasses and soft-leafed plants. These plains graded into the forest and scrub biomes of Mediterranean France, and inevitably the southern farmers joined the other newcomers. The linear pottery culture, or LBK culture, dating 7,500 to 6,500 BP, became part of Vigor and Child's Danubian I culture because the Middle Danube was the focus of the majority of LBK sites. This linear pottery culture covers a number of countries, including almost all of France, and archaeologically we are at the Middle Neolithic, 7,500 to 7,000 BP, with early and middle linear pottery culture. This archaeological manifestation concludes in the late Neolithic from 7,000 to 6,500 BP with its late linear pottery and even later legacy cultures. Now, until a North American has lived in or at least visited the postage stamp-sized West European countries, it is difficult to comprehend how small they are. An area the size of the North American Great Plains, from the subarctic to the Gulf of Mexico, exists from the Russian frontier to Atlantic Portugal in the UK. And anyway, my point is that the Danubian I culture we call linear pottery sites included sites on the Middle Elbe River and the Upper Rhine River, and eventually all of mainland France. The diagnostic early linear pottery consists of simple cups, bowls, vases, and jugs without handles. As a cultural type, it comes in two Hungarian flavors: the Western linear pottery culture on the Middle Danube, including Western Hungary, and then was carried down the Rhine River, Elbe, Oder, and Vistula rivers, and the Eastern linear pottery culture in Eastern Hungary. The French extension witnessed people crossing back and forth from France to Italy on one end of the Riviera to Iberia on the other for centuries. In time, other farming populations arriving from the North and East Atlantic and from Hungary arrived onto what is contemporary mainland France, joining those of the Riviera. On the North German plains, there is an archaeological culture called Rossen, dated 6,600 to 6,300 BP, with LBK stone technology and diagnostic pottery. It spread into Benelux, that is Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and northeastern France, and it emerges from the LBK and has evidence of social ranking in the existence of craft specialists that made the funnel bakers. Its community pattern is also transitional from single farm units to trapezoidal or boat-shaped longhouses. These were up to over 200 feet in length. The ground plans for them suggest a sloping roofline. Multiple internal partitions are frequent, indicating several family units per longhouse, arranged in villages surrounded by earthwork enclosures. Accordingly, Rossen settlements cover less acreage than the preceding single-farm unit villages, and therefore we see that the mature Neolithic in northeast France is well on the road to advanced theocratic chiefdom stage society. A contemporary archaeological culture occupied the French plains, plateau, the Seine Basin, and the Loire Valley, including the entire Parisian region called the Chassin culture from 6,500 for 1,000 years to 5,500 BP. Their mode of production included wood canoes, pottery, bows and arrows, wood and stone tools made by sedentary people farming rye, panic grass, millet, apples, pears, and prunes while herding goats, and oxen. They lived in huts organized into small villages of 100 to 400 people, and their pottery was utilitarian without decoration, and their technology was stone-based with copper appearing in later phases. It is particularly important to us because these people soon became simple chiefdoms, and in this special case, we can see that the subsequent evolution, their subsequent evolution into the advanced theocratic chiefdom stage. That appears in the archaeological Seine-Oise-Marne SOM culture from 5100 to 4000 BP in northern France and into another group of ATCs in southern France. One outcome of this culture contact was the nationwide annual migration of shepherds and their domesticated cattle and sheep. This transhumance continues to this day. These shepherds built roofless, round, dry stone shelters known as capitelles, where the stone walls converge at the top to form a vault. Some are still built and used in the Gard River, Toulon, and Montpellier regions. Prehistorically, these shepherds carried the cardium diagnostic ceramics, named for the decorative imprinting of the clay pottery with the shell of a cockle. Cockles are an edible marine mollusk, Cerastoderma edule, and their shells were used to imprint distinctive patterns on cardium pottery. Early specimens are found in the Ferries Cave at Leucate. Now, the Italian simple chiefdom people meet the French simple chiefdoms. The seafarers that entered the French Riviera from Italy were at the simple chiefdom stage. They met other similarly advanced folk as they moved inland, where they encountered recently emerged autochthonous simple chiefdoms. Some of these simple chiefdoms then evolved autochthonously into ATCs, and an example on point lies in Languedoc, where indigenous megaliths date as early as 5,500 BP. Languedoc became a thriving ATC homeland in France. They left behind one of the richest megalith areas in the world, containing 800 dolmens and menhirs. Surgically trepanned human skulls have been found at the dolmen at Nozered, where suture knitting was successful. Archaeologically, it is classified as the final Neolithic, and as such marks the transition between the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. Now this brings us to a special topic on the Beaker Chalcolithic of the Tagus Estuary, an advanced theocratic chiefdom. The Beaker material complex consists of ceramic pottery and metalwork in copper and gold. The metal artifacts are vessels and projectile points for archery and jewelry. Initially, they were products of professional specialists in the ATC of Portugal's Tagus Estuary near contemporary Lisbon. As the ATC evolved, it had a rank of traders identical to those of the Aztecs of central Mexico. When at a later time the ATC became a class-divided state-organized society, so the Beaker Chalcolithic formally transformed into private property. However, as I say, that is another story for another later time. For now, the important thing is that the high-ranking Chalcolithic spread its trade in ceramic and copper tools to tribal agriculturalists and simple chieftain peoples throughout the Iberian Peninsula and into France. Now, the Beaker period marks a period of intracontinental cultural contact in Europe from the West Atlantic to the Russo-Polish frontier. Beginning in 4400 BP, a guild of craftspeople began selling their goods within Europe's corded ware culture area. As I have said, the guild was a structural equivalent to the Aztec Chalcolithic. Its sales work spread over Central and Eastern Europe. Business was good with the corded ware people as far east as Poland, and proof that this is a Chalcolithic type sales activity lies in the fact that there is no culture change among the corded ware peoples contacted. There are two main international ceramic Beaker styles. One is the all-over ornamental AOO style, patterned all over with impressions, of which a subset is the all-over corded, or AOC, patterned with cord impressions, and two, the maritime type, decorated with bands filled with impressions made with a comb or cord. Later, other characteristic regional styles developed. AOO and AOC beaker forms evolved from pre-Beaker pottery forms in the Lower Rhine and North Sea regions, at least for Northern and Central Europe. And that maritime arm was a rank of Chalcolithic type rank of traders who moved on ships. Now, at any rate, as opposed to using animals to carry their goods on land. In the beginning, the beakers were widely used for cooking and eating food and for containing beverages, including alcohol. In the latter regard, they were perfect for that purpose and replaced otherwise clumsy local products, creating the original markets for the Chalcolithic salespeople. And in time, salespeople hawked them as reducing pots for smelting copper from appropriate local ores. As society began differentiating into chiefdom ranks, it was natural that the traders would offer a spectrum of beakers priced to these ranks, and so they did, as we can see in the record provided by archaeology. Radiocarbon dating indicates that the earliest maritime Beaker design style is found in the Copos beakers of the Tagus River in Iberia that reflects North African contact via seaborne traders. In the copper-using communities of the Tagus Estuary in Portugal around 4800 to 4700 BP, a Portuguese advanced theocratic chiefdom arose that had a Chalcolithic that sold these beakers as ceramic vessels and copper-reducing tools. These products were well received wherever the traders went and spread, including to the corded ware peoples of Germany. From the Tagus Estuary ATC, the Beaker traders moved to enclaves in southwest Spain and then southern France around the Gulf de Lyon. A northern move incorporated the coast between the Seine and the Loire that includes the Brittany Peninsula extending inland and down the Atlantic coast. The enclave established in southern Brittany was linked by river and land routes via the Loire and across the Gâtinais Valley to the Seine Valley and thence to the Lower Rhine. This was a long-established route now used by the maritime Beaker traders as they reached the Lower Rhine in or about 4600 BP. other Bell Beaker Calpulli reached Sespel Island in Hungary by 4500 BP. In the Carpathian Basin, the Bell Beaker Calpulli sold to communities of the Vucedol culture. Now these had evolved from the Yamna culture and were at the same level of metallurgy practiced by Bell Beaker metal workers that happily accepted the trade goods and knowledge. Here, Bell Beaker craftspeople assimilated local pottery forms, such as the polypod cup. These commonware types of pottery then spread in association with the classic Bell Beaker. From the Carpathian Basin, the Bell Beaker Calpulli traders sailed down the Rhine and eastward into what is now Germany and Poland. By this time, the Rhine was on the western edge of the vast corded ware zone, and from the Rhine to the Loire, these traders sailed northwards across the English Channel to Britain. The earliest copper production in Ireland's Ross Island dates 4400 to 4200 BP and is associated with early Beaker pottery. Here, the local sulfur arsenide ores were smelted to produce the first copper axes used in Britain and Ireland. Since the technology is identical to that of the Tagus estuary ATC, technology that had spread to France, it is proof that these same Calpulli traders brought it to Ireland. The traders left knowledge of which they could not have been aware about the overall agricultural economy in the form of palynology. That pollen evidence proves an increased growing of barley, which is associated with beer brewing. Analysis of the bronze tools of the Beaker complex proves multiple copper sources over time. First, an Iberian source, followed by Central European and Bohemian ores. Southeast France was an important Calpulli crossroads and way station. From their French base, some Bell Beakers traders used the sea and rivers to travel to Ireland, and others to the Carpathian Basin. The new international trade routes opened by the Beaker Calpulli eventually became firmly established, and the barrier causing the hiatus mentioned above does not have an immediate geographical cause. The Koros culture ended in the middle of the Hungarian plain, and although the climate to the north is colder, the gradient is not so sharp as to form a barrier. What is happening at this time was a consequence of what happened immediately after the final Neolithic during the Chalcolithic or Copper Age. In the archaeological data, we are seeing the socio-cultural transition from the advanced theocratic chiefdom to the slave stage in France. There is a late Neolithic culture of the Paris Basin of northeast France, dating 5,400 to 4,800 BP, called the Seine-Oise Marne, or SOM, as it's named after these three rivers. It has megalithic ATC diagnostics in the form of gallery grave type tombs, semi-subterranean funerary houses, and covered walkways. The tombs have porthole slabs. In the chalk country of the Marne River, rock-cut tombs were similarly made, and some have hafted axes or schematized goddess figures carved on their walls. Artifacts include transverse arrows, antlered daggers, and rough, plain, flat-based pots of cylinder and bucket shapes. The local pottery type is the coarseware, flat-based flower pot. Copper was imported, as were Calais stone and beads, and Grand Piscini flint. The SOM type of megalithic tomb is found from Brittany to Belgium, Westphalia, and Sweden, while similar crude pottery occurs in Brittany, West France, Switzerland, and Denmark. The Seine-Oise Marne culture was at the ATC stage. Along with the Bell Beaker trade items, we have proof that the extant stage readily accepted contact with the interloper traders who sold transverse arrowheads, antler sleeves, and crude, flat-based, cylindrical, and bucket-shaped pottery decorated with applique cordons. The SOM culture had its own trade links with neighboring cultures, obtaining thereby Calais and Grand Piscini flint, imported from Brittany and the Loire. The SOM traded its own copper work in exchange. The culture had the gallery grave design common across Europe, and the pottery types comparable to the Western France from 4600 BP, and in Brittany, Switzerland, and Denmark. This is an indicator of the spread of the unifying ATC religion. About 4600 BP, the Artenacean culture developed in Dordogne as a reaction to the advance of Danubian people of the SOM over western France. Armed with typical arrows, they took over all Atlantic France and Belgium by 4400 BP, and this created a stable border with the Corded-ware people near the Rhine for 1,000 years. In southeast France, megalith building groups evolved from Chassin culture appear. The Beaker trading rank from 4800 to 3900 BP expanded their activity over most of France without otherwise affecting the pre-existing cultures, proving Beakers to be an economic force rather than anything else. So the early Bronze Age archaeological cultures in France are all advanced theocratic chiefdoms and thus include the transitional Beaker traders from 4800 to 3900 BP. Included as ATCs are the tumulus culture people 3600 to 3200 BP and Urnfield culture people 3300 to 2800 BP. Northeast French Bronze Age sites in Brittany show Beaker traders' contact, as do some of England's Wessex culture and Central Europe's Unities culture. The Urnfield period saw a dramatic increase in population in the region, resulting from the social organization of the ATC stage in the mode of production. Identical advance is recorded among the people of southern France, Iberia, and the Ligures on the Mediterranean coast, and the Basques in southwest France and Spain. Few metal discoveries have been made in the northern half of France. However, it is in the Paris Basin that the oldest metal objects date 5500 BP. Nevertheless, the region was exclusively a metal consumer during the years prior to 5000 BP, and the use of metal in the Paris Basin remained a secondary matter for local groups. In contrast to the Paris Basin, the southern half of France could count on a wide range of copper ore resources. The mining and metallurgical district of Cabrières-Perret in Languedoc developed its activities over a long period starting in 5200 BP. The study of this mining district reveals an integrated production site where copper ore mining zones are close to metal manufacturing operations. Accordingly, the Cabrières-Perret locality developed an appropriate mode of production dynamic where metallurgy was central. This is a germinal of the French bourgeoisie. There were other models of copper production. We have seen that the Languedoc featured early autochthonous simple chiefdoms, and there are now others on the southern border of the Massif Central, such as the Alclaus settlement. Alclaus was a simple chiefdom village featuring small-scale, occasional domestic copper production, that is, within the living units. These produced articles were sold locally. The Alclaus model of domestic production and sale to local markets is an alternative to the Cabrières model, important to us because it proves both forms of transition from early to advanced copper metallurgy. The earliest form well demonstrated in the domestic production of copper ore tools at Alclaus, and the advanced form demonstrated in the professionalization of copper production at Cabrières-Perret. Now we come to Bronze Age France from 4000 to 2700 BP. At 4000 BP there was a decline in metal production on the southern border of the Massif Central. At the same time, that is, the beginning of the early Bronze Age, an increase in the exploitation of copper resources in the French Alps is to be noticed. Thus the mining and metallurgical site of Saint Véran at Haut Alps developed a specific high-yield metallurgical process similar to the one that spread over the whole Alpine zone throughout the Bronze Age. Therefore, the Cabrières, Alclaus, Saint Véran models are phases also in the technological evolution of metallurgy in France from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age. For France, the term Neolithic means the technological phase of the first appearance of metallurgy and the rise of the ATC stage. The French Bronze Age begins as an ATC stage lasting for 1,000 years and then extends another 500 years as part of the French slave stage. Which brings us to the French slave stage. The beginning of the slave stage in France takes the form of early kingdoms. It featured the technical perfection of bronze metallurgy, and accordingly we see it in the three main Bronze Age provinces in France. These were on 1, the West Atlantic coast, 2, the North Alpine area, and then 3, the entire Western Mediterranean. The early Bronze Age was characterized by transformation of social ranks into classes, as proven by the differential social consumption of bronze and in funeral practices. The Middle Bronze Age featured an increase in professionalized metallurgical production and the invention of the rapier and the sword. The Late Bronze Age in France features a great deal of bronze production and storage. The impact of agricultural production, including animal pasturage, modified the environment even in the mountains. Simultaneously, roads and land division reflects new forms of property ownership and small plow farming. In southern France, immense necropolises containing several hundreds of individuals form vast cities of the dead. These are disconnected from settlements and occupy otherwise unusable locales. The Bronze Age was characterized by demographic growth, where the new social hierarchy were its new land ownership relations that underlie the altered landscape exist. The classification of societies proposed by anthropologist Professor Elman Service, Alan Johnson, and Timothy Earle prove societies evolved from the tribal agriculture through the chiefdom stages. The accumulating archaeological evidence within this framework always returns to the reality of the emergence of metallurgy. One reason, of course, is that what we recover so plentifully in archaeological investigation is metallurgy. Now, this is especially important for us, as it is the motor of technological change within the mode of production at this time. Reflections on Europe. It has been proven that the first collection of Europe's copper ores took place on the borders of the Black Sea about 7,000 years ago in the Balkans. By this period, Middle Neolithic communities already had considerable experience of mining, and they were equipped with the technical knowledge for extracting native copper and copper carbonates. The production of copper by high temperatures coincided with the mining activity of the early Chalcolithic age there at 6,600 BP, as seen in the Bulgarian necropolis of the Varna Karanovo culture. As we have seen, gold necklaces and bracelets were found lying alongside massive copper shaft-hole axes. Metallurgy subsequently spread to the Carpathian Basin, Hungary, Poland, and central Germany. It was not until 5,800 BP that it reached the Alps, the Swiss plateau, and the Basin culture, and northern Italy. As always, the production of melt for native copper begins with simple heating. Then the extraction of copper from carbonates is undertaken, and this appears in Europe in the Carpathian Balkans by 8,000 BP and in the Alpine Arc in the south of France by 6,000 BP. The exploitation of copper ore sulfides from chalcopyrite took somewhat longer, appearing in Western Europe in the middle of the Bronze Age. The sequence of the type of copper ore smelted shows an increasingly high level of skill, such as would be associated with the ATC, the Advanced Theocratic Chiefdom, and then slave stage professional specialization. Native copper metallurgy required no more knowledge than could be possessed by domestic tribal agricultural units. Extractive metallurgy for carbonated ores required more knowledge and organization, such as provided by the simple chiefdom, and metallurgy for the exploitation of copper sulfides, on the other hand, involved the delicate operation of separating copper from iron, constituting the most complex process of all. Its appearance in France proves the firm establishment of the slave stage. And that brings us to a conclusion of this morning's lecture. And in the next lecture, we're going to move on to the same period of sociocultural time in Italy. It is the Neolithic, Chalcolithic, and Bronze Age, the tribal agriculture, simple chiefdoms, and advanced theocratic chiefdom stages in Italy.